So two main things happen that make a glucose spike harmful for your body. Number one has to do with your mitochondria. So as glucose floods into your bloodstream and your cells, it heads to your mitochondria. And there, unfortunately, your mitochondria kind of shut down under such a big influx, a big tsunami of glucose to deal with. Your mitochondria then become stressed. They send out free radicals. These free radicals lead to inflammation, and that creates a lovely terrain for all chronic diseases. Number two, when there's a lot of glucose in your body, this reaction called glycation happens at a faster rate. Glycation is aging, and it's actually similar to cooking. It's what happens when you put a piece of toast in the toaster and it goes from white to brown. That's glycation. That's toasting. That's cooking. And in your body, from the moment you're born, you start toasting. And then when you're fully toast, you die. And with every glucose spike, you're accelerating that process of aging. Last thing that happens in your body, every time you have a glucose spike, your body is going to send out insulin to grab excess glucose and store it away in your muscles, in your liver, and then in your fat cells. And that's one of the ways that we put on weight. Anyway, that's the biology underpinning everything, but we feel glucose spikes on many, many levels.
Well, let's get into the details. We've gotten into the nitty gritty of the science. You've talked about, weight gain can be, at the end of the physiology there. But let's get into some of the other conditions that can come up if people are spiking their glucose on a chronic basis.
Yeah, so the most common symptoms that people report are unsteady energy levels. So feeling tired throughout the day, having cravings, so craving sweet foods between meals for dessert, being hungry all the time. So being hungry every 90 minutes. You just ate a couple hours ago, but all of a sudden you're famished again. Then impact on your skin, so wrinkles, acne, rosacea, any inflammatory disease. Impact on your sleep, poor sleep. You wake up, you're not rested. Weight gain. Impact on your fertility. So, worsening polycystic ovarian syndrome symptoms or difficult menopause. This is especially true in women. And then long-term, the development of conditions like prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and a favorable terrain for cancer, Alzheimer's, and heart disease. So, the summary is that glucose spikes really are to be avoided, and we feel it instantly in a matter of minutes, but it's also really important for our long-term health.
And for somebody listening, saying to themselves, I feel generally good, my weight is generally quote unquote good, how many people are affected by this?
90% of the population has glucose spikes every day without knowing it. And that's really the fundamental reason that we should all care about it. Because even if, you're healthy looking on the outside, whatever that means, by the way, could you feel better than you currently do? That's the question you should ask yourself. Could you feel more energized? Could you feel more steady throughout the day? Could you improve your relationship to food? Could you sleep better? All of these questions are really important. And what I've seen in myself and in the community that I've created is that everybody benefits from flattening their glucose curves.
Well, let's talk about what we mean by a glucose spike, because naturally when we ingest a meal, it's going to affect the glucose levels unless, we're having maybe pure fat or something like that. But mostly when we're having a meal with a variety of different things, our glucose level is going to be impacted. So what constitutes when that's too much and it becomes a problem?
So I'm going to explain where glucose comes from and where you get it in foods. So glucose is originally created by plants during photosynthesis, and it's then turned into either fiber or sugar or starch. And as a human, the way for your cells to get glucose, because glucose is your body's preferred energy source, so it's very important to get some, the easiest way we get glucose is by eating either starchy foods or sweet foods. So starchy foods, we're talking about bread, pasta, rice, potatoes, etc. And then sweet foods, we're talking about desserts, anything sweet like fruit, etc. And since glucose is your body's main energy source, you might think like, oh, well, I should just eat more glucose and I'll have more energy. But that's actually not the case. It's a bit like if you give a plant too much water and it drowns. When you give a human body too much glucose, problems start piling up. So there's no like specific line about like this is okay as a quantity and just here is too much glucose. We just know that overall we want to reduce the variability of the glucose spikes in our body, get them to be a bit smoother so that we can feel better and we can heal.
You got into a little bit there, the difference between starch and sugar. Let's get into the nuance there a little bit deeper because, the sugar from those two different sources is different in the body. So I'd like you to get into the details.
Yeah, of course. So glucose exists, as I mentioned, in starchy and sweet foods. But there's one key difference, which is that in sweet foods, you also have fructose. And this is very important because if you just looked at the glucose response of a starchy food and a sweet food, you might see the same glucose spike, but the sweet food also has this invisible fructose spike that you cannot see on a glucose monitor. And it's very important because fructose is even worse for our body than just glucose. So it glycates things faster in your body, makes you age quicker. It causes more inflammation. It causes more likelihood of type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, etc. So starchy and sweet foods are not the same. And that's why one of the hacks that I share is that it's always better to pick a starchy or a savory food over a sweet food because of the presence of fructose.
And you talked about the invisible fructose spike that we're going to have when the glucose spikes in the case of having a sweet food. There's also an invisible insulin spike when we have
absolutely.
glucose. So let's talk about that factor as well.
Yeah, so your body's way to respond to a glucose spike is to release insulin. And insulin, has gotten a bad rep, but actually we need insulin to live. And people who don't have the ability to make insulin, people with type 1 diabetes, they have to inject multiple times a day to make up for what that pancreas can't produce. So insulin gets released after every glucose spike. And what it does is it takes the glucose and it stores it away in these different storage containers. Unfortunately, same thing as, the water for the plant, too much insulin also causes issues. So too much insulin over time is the main driver of prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. So while it's useful, one of the great consequences of flattening your glucose curves is also reducing the amount of insulin in your body.
Let's get into insulin resistance. And I love the analogy you share in your book talking about at a different chapter in your life when you were addicted to caffeine and you kept upping your caffeine just to get to that baseline level of energy.
Yeah.
Talk about what was happening in the body with the caffeine and how that relates to insulin.
I mean, I don't know if you've experienced this, but I go through phases of drinking coffee and not drinking coffee. And what I find is that if I haven't had coffee in a month, let's say, and I have, a tiny little shot of espresso, I'm wired. And then I keep having, an espresso every day. And then after a week, I'm like, I'm not really feeling that energized. I need another shot. And you build up what's called tolerance. So your body does not respond to the substance as quickly, as intensely as it did before. And so when I'm done with my coffee phase, I can have like 3 coffees a day and I still don't feel as energized as I did on that very first day. So then I stop coffee altogether. I'm like, okay, time to readjust and to let my body become resensitized to that molecule. The same thing happens with insulin. So insulin's job is to help glucose get into the cells. Unfortunately, over time, when a lot of insulin is released, you need more and more insulin to do the same job. Your cells, your body has become slowly resistant to insulin. And you see this because you see fasting insulin levels rise and rise and rise and rise. And then at some point, your fasting glucose level will start rising as well. A lot of insulin in the body is a precursor to conditions like prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. It happens years before you get diagnosed with those conditions. And too much insulin in the body is just a really big alert symbol that your metabolism is starting to suffer and that you're on the road towards those conditions. And then also in people who have ovaries, too much insulin in the body is also a key driver of a lot of deregulation, hormonal deregulation that can cause issues.
And the crazy thing is when people have type 2 diabetes, they end up injecting insulin and then they're just furthering the problem and continuing that cascade.
It's a bit like if you said, okay, well, Jessie, 3 cups of coffee is not waking you up anymore. And if you said, just drink more coffee. And, that would work, quote unquote, but I'm still becoming more and more resistant to caffeine. I'm not solving the underlying resistance issue. And so, yeah, often when somebody has type 2 diabetes and they haven't been able to manage it, you start getting insulin. And so insulin temporarily brings glucose levels down, but those insulin levels are still really, really, really high. So a lot of other problems accumulate, and you're not solving the baseline issue, which is too much insulin and insulin resistance, or being insulin desensitized.
Well, the good news is for somebody who is on that path and maybe they're type 2 diabetic and they're injecting insulin right now, we're going to give a whole bunch of hacks. We've already given one, but we're going to get into a lot of solutions that get to the source of the problem. So within your community, how often do you see people that go from being type 2 diabetic to not needing insulin over time after applying what we're going to talk about today?
That's hard to say. What I can tell you is that in these clinical trials, this has been effective. In my community, I get messages every day of people who've used the hacks, but not just for type 2 diabetes. It's actually, I would say it's a pretty small fraction of my community who are people who have diabetes. A lot of people gravitate towards the hacks and use the hacks because they just want to feel better. They just want to have more energy. They just want to have clearer skin. They want to solve their fertility issues. They want to lose weight. They want to help their mental health. A lot of those things. It's not just for diabetics anymore. Of course, if you're somebody with diabetes, these hacks will help you. And the studies that I base my work on have been done in the first place on people with diabetes because that's the condition that we associate with glucose. So that's been the focus for a long time, but now we know that's shifting and that it's actually for everybody.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
90% of the population has glucose spikes every day without knowing it. And so I dove into the research and I discovered that actually there were things I could do, principles I could use that would allow me